A lot of people say, I hate small talk, and I understand why. It can feel really superficial, as though you're just filling the room with observations about the weather, the meeting room and how cold it is, or maybe how difficult it was to commute to the office and to find parking. But expecting immediate depth from someone that you've just met or has only a professional relationship with is unrealistic. So small talk is really the bridge between we don't really know each other really well and we're comfortable enough to have a real conversation. And once you start to treat it that way, it does begin to feel much less fake and much more useful. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to make small talk easier and how to move naturally toward more meaningful topics and how to stop feeling as though you need an endlessly fascinating personality just to have a great conversation. Small talk is important at work because relationships rarely begin with a very deeply personal or important conversation. They usually begin in the few minutes before a meeting, while you're waiting for an event to start, or maybe you happen to be standing beside someone you don't quite know. So those are the moments that can look insignificant, but they actually create familiarity. And familiarity does create comfort, and comfort makes it easier for people to share more of what they think, what they are working on, and what matters to them. For a lot of quiet professionals, this is especially important. You may prefer conversations that have substance, but getting to that substance usually requires a little bit more of a runway. And the good news is that you don't need to become a master of like this great banter. You just need curiosity, observation, and a simple structure that helps the conversation develop. So a lot of people dislike small talk because they judge it by the wrong standard. So they expect the first few sentences to be interesting, memorable, or meaningful. When that conversation begins with something ordinary, they just assume the interaction is going to be shallow. But ordinary topics actually serve a purpose. So when we meet someone new, we're actually assessing a few things about them. Does this interaction feel comfortable? Is this person interested in having a conversation with me? Do we have anything in common? And is there a reason to continue this conversation? So small talk actually allows both people to answer those questions without actually requiring a large amount of vulnerability at the beginning. So think of it as like a little bit of a warm-up. You wouldn't normally walk up to someone you've never met and immediately ask about the most difficult professional decision that they've ever made. And that might actually become a fascinating conversation, but it would take some time for you to develop that relationship until that conversation will feel genuine. So a very simple way to create that warm-up is the anchor, reveal, and encourage framework. So starting with anchor, this is really about starting with something that you can observe or experience. So it might be the meeting, the location, the speaker, the agenda, the event, the queue that you're in, or even the weather. And the anchor gives the conversation a shared starting point. So you might say something like, this agenda is ambitious, or that last session gave us a lot to think about, or this is a much bigger turnout than I expected. The next step is reveal. So add a short comment or a small piece of information about yourself. So you're giving the other person something to respond to rather than simply placing them under a spotlight. So for example, this agenda is ambitious. I'm especially interested in the leadership section. Or that last session gave us a lot to think about. I've been having similar conversations with several of my clients. The last step is to encourage, which is to ask an easy and open question. So this agenda is ambitious. I'm especially interested in the leadership section. What brought you to the session? And that conversation has somewhere to go because you've established a shared reality, you've revealed a small amount about yourself, and also you've invited the other person in. So small talk becomes awkward when we expect ourselves to produce an interesting topic out of nowhere. And the anchor actually gives you somewhere simple just to begin. So a good opening creates comfort, but the conversation can still feel unnatural when one person is asking all the questions and revealing nothing about themselves. So, thoughtful questions are useful, especially if you're naturally curious and you enjoy learning about other people. But question after question can start to feel like an interview. So the other person answers one question, and then before they finish, you're like, okay, what's the next question? Eventually, they may start wondering whether they're networking or applying for some type of job. So a more natural rhythm is ask, share something related, then ask a follow-up question. So for example, you might begin with, what brought you to this conference? And the person explains that they're here to attend because their organization is going through a leadership transition. And you could respond by saying, that makes sense. I'm here because several of my clients have been asking about speaking confidence and leadership visibility. Is the transition affecting the way people are communicating inside your organization? So now you've done several things. You've asked a question, you've listened to the answer, and you've shared something relevant about yourself and invited the person to take the conversation further. And that small amount of disclosure is really helpful because connection requires some reciprocity. So you don't need to reveal anything deeply personal, and you're simply allowing the other person to understand something about your work, your interests, or perspective. And this also makes it easier for them to ask you a question in return. So a good conversation should feel like a movement between two people, rather than just one person gathering information. Okay, so one reason small talk becomes stressful is that people are mentally searching for the next perfect question while the other person is still answering the current one. So you don't need a large number of prompts to get started. You need to listen for one detail that is worth exploring. So a conversational hook could be a project, a location, a challenge, a hobby, an opinion, a recent change. So a person might say, our team recently went through a reorganization. So the hook is the reorganization. Then you can ask, what has changed most for you since the reorganization? Or, how has that affected the way your team works together? And someone might mention that they recently moved from another city. You could ask something like, what has the adjustment been like? Or someone might say they are preparing for an important presentation. And you can ask what part of the presentation feels most important to get right. And the conversation begins to deepen because you are responding to something that they actually said rather than jumping to a completely unrelated topic. And this is where being a careful listener becomes a real advantage. So you don't have to speak constantly. You simply have to notice the thread and stay with it long enough for the conversation to develop. So if professional conversation tends to feel difficult for you because you're trying to find the right words in the moment, download my free resource, 7 Scripts for Leadership Presence. And it gives you practical language for entering conversations, asking useful questions, and also sharing your perspective and speaking with more clarity without sounding overly rehearsed. You'll find the link below. And keep watching because once the conversation feels comfortable, there is a simple way to move it from surface level towards something that is more substantial. So small talk doesn't have to stay small. Once the initial exchange feels comfortable, you can gradually move towards more substantive topics. So a simple progression is fact, experience, challenge, or meaning. So you might begin with a factual question. So what kind of work do you do? Once the answer, move towards their experience. What part of that work do you enjoy most? And from there, you might explore a challenge. So what has been difficult lately? And then if the conversation supports it, you can move towards meaning. So what makes that issue important to you? So you don't need to move from every single level in a single conversation. The point here is to recognize that depth usually develops in stages. So here's another example. You ask, what brought you to the event? And they say they're trying to meet more people outside their immediate function. So you might respond with, what made that feel important now? And they may explain that they want to understand more of the business before applying for a larger leadership role. So now the conversation has moved from attendance at the event to professional growth, visibility, and ambition. And that is such a meaningful discussion, but it does take time to naturally develop it because you allow familiarity to come first. So you can also deepen a conversation by noticing similarities. So you may say, I had a similar experience when I moved into a broader role. Or I hear from a lot of professionals who are trying to become more visible without feeling overly self-promotional. So shared experiences will help people feel understood, but try not to take over the conversation with your own story. Just share enough to create connection, then return the focus to the person. Now, The tone you establish affects how easy that conversation feels. So a little lightness can reduce tension, especially when both people are navigating an unfamiliar interaction. So you don't need a stand-up routine or something that is going to be so curated, but a simple observation is often enough. So as an example, this may be the first meeting where everyone arrived before the coffee. Or, I thought I was early, but apparently everyone else had the same strategy. So the purpose isn't to prove that you're funny or outgoing. It really is to make the interaction feel a little bit more human. So lightness works best when it comes from the shared situation. It doesn't actually target another person. So you can also smile at the ordinary awkwardness of professional events. Most people know that networking and small talk can actually feel really uncomfortable. So acknowledging that lightly can make both people relax. So an example of this is I always find the first conversation at these events the hardest. After that, it gets much easier. So that is honest without making the other person responsible for having to manage your discomfort. So you're simply naming a familiar experience. A lighter tone can make the conversation flow, but many quiet professionals still become anxious the moment that there is a pause. So a pause doesn't necessarily mean that the interaction has failed. The other person may be thinking, you may be considering what to say next. So the conversation is going to reach a natural transition. When people panic at a pause, they often start filling it with nervousness and they repeat themselves. They introduce an unrelated topic or they keep talking long after the original point has already landed. So you can use a pause in 3 ways: to reflect, transition, or to end the conversation. So to reflect, take a second to think about what the person said. You might respond with, "That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way." Then ask a follow-up. To transition, use the pause to move toward another topic. So you mentioned your team earlier. How has the new structure been working? Or you can use transition to end gracefully. So sometimes the conversation has naturally reached an end, and you can say something like, "It was so lovely talking to you. I'm going to say hello to a few more people, but I'm glad we connected." Or, "I'll let you get back to your evening, but shall we connect on LinkedIn?" So knowing that you can exit politely actually reduces the anxiety of that conversation. A lot of people avoid starting conversations because they worry that it will trap them in. But when you have an exit line ready, the interaction will feel much more manageable. And now, if this was small talk before a meeting, you might want to start with some openers like, "How is your morning going? What are you hoping we resolve today? How has your week been so far?" Right? Or at an event, you might ask, "What brought you here? Which sessions has been most useful? And how did you hear about this event?" With someone you know lightly, you might say, "You mentioned that project last time. How did it turn out?" Or, "What has been taking most of your attention recently?" Or, "How are things going with the new team?" So notice that none of these questions are actually clever. They work because they are easy to understand and give the other person a chance to reveal a thread that is worth following. So here's a challenge for you. For the next week, use anchor, reveal, and encourage once a day. So the interaction doesn't need to be long. You can use it before a meeting, in a virtual call, or while waiting for an event to begin, or during a conversation with someone that you only know casually. So afterward, note 3 things about yourself. What anchor did I use? What detail did I learn? Which follow-up question helped the conversation continue? And you're looking for patterns. Which openings felt natural to you? What kinds of details were easiest to explore? And when did the other person become more engaged? Small talk will improve through repetition and not through consuming all the YouTube videos about prompts and opening lines. So you need enough practice for the structure to feel familiar. So small talk is not meaningless. It does create familiarity. It establishes comfort and it opens the door to a more substantive conversation. And you don't need endlessly fascinating topics. And you don't need to perform extroversion. Notice something you share. Reveal a little. Ask something easy, then listen for the next thread. Use anchor, reveal, encourage to begin. Balance your questions with small amounts of disclosure and follow the conversational hooks the other person is giving you, and allow the discussion just to move gradually from facts towards experiences, challenges, and meaning. And when there is a pause, just let it breathe. You're just having a conversation. Download my free 7 scripts for leadership presence below if you want practical language for navigating professional conversations with more confidence. Then watch the final video in this playlist where I'm going to show you how to be seen at work without becoming the loudest person in the room.